This is a journey into sound. A journey which along the way will bring to you new color, new dimension, new values, and a new experience.
Welcome to the G-Spot Podcast. I'm your guide, Katie Silcox, bringing you your weekly self-love soundbite. Join us for conversations around sex, spirit, and all things self-care. All things self-care. All things self-care.
This is a journey into sound.
Uno, dos, tres, cuatro.
You are a G-Spot Podcast with Katie Silcox.
So welcome everybody to the G-Spot. I am here with a beautiful person that I have been wanting to have on the show for a long time, really since I started the G-Spot. I am here today with Scott Blossom, who is a traditional Chinese medical practitioner. He's also a yoga teacher and an Ayurvedic consultant. He has a beautiful website, drblossom.com. We'll provide you guys with all the links to Scott in the show notes. But in addition to all of these accolades, Scott is someone that I had the pleasure, I don't know if he remembers, but we did a fire ceremony together in the woods in Northern California with Dr. Robert Svoboda. And you guys started singing love songs in Portuguese and English and of course Sanskrit, and I just knew, like, okay, these are my people. I really love this. And I've been religiously following Scott's work since then. And what I really love about Scott, and having experienced his teachings a few times in various festivals and such, is just, and as you guys will see in the show, like, Scott knows so much about the depths of meaning of these traditions, and yet he has such a beautiful sense of humor. And just before we got on the show, we were listening to him interface with his soon-to-be teenage son, and there's just a level of being in the world that I really love and admire about Scott. And so we have so much to discuss. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Yeah. I love that you mentioned that about the fire ceremony with Dr. Svoboda, because Dr. Svoboda grew up in Oklahoma, and he had this interesting situation where this person from his hometown had moved to New York City and become like a big time like choral director, like a chorus director, and then moved back later in her life and showed up in this little town in Oklahoma. It was like, look, y'all, I'm coming from New York. We're going to get this together. And so he had this incredible teacher for singing. And so Dr. Svoboda is literally like a living jukebox. If you get him going into he can chant a million trillion Sanskrit mantras and all the stuff from the yoga, the tantric tradition. But he also knows pretty much the entire Beatles, portfolio, as well as all these hymns. Incredible hymns, really, and knows so many. And so, like you said, it's and his guru was like that too, where his guru really was, you could say, ecumenical, in the sense of, if something has the bhav, if something has that feeling, then the more languages the better, because you're just sort of then you're starting to get kind of gratuitous about the way you adore the divine.
Yeah, I remember him getting out of your car, and of course I'd read all of his books on Tantra, and this is back when I was really just so into this discovery of Tantra, having grown up myself as, Christian Southern Baptist. And I remember him getting out of the car, and he was wearing a Hawaiian shirt, and it was very somber, and there were all these goddessy women and decked out in all these beautiful flowing clothes, and one of the women just said, "Well, hello, how are you?" And he just very seriously said, "I'm well up to this point." And then he just took off into the forest to collect firewood. And I was just you know what? I'm going with them. And I just started walking after him, and I was like, "Can I help you?" And he was like, "If that is your desire." And so I just helped him gather wood. And that's my Robert Svoboda story.
Nice. Yes.
Oh my goodness.
To humans as humans.
Yeah.
And the body as an organism. He definitely has a very doctorial kind of manner sometimes.
Well, here we are, Scott. We were speaking before about what we were going to talk about, and we decided to meet today because we thought, oh, by then we might have this sense of like where things are in our world, in our country. And so I just kind of want to take a moment to steep ourselves in the moment that we find ourselves. And I think thinking about these topics that you and I wanted to talk about, especially this, maybe we'll start off with this idea of bhakti, and a lot of our listeners might know what that is, but I would just love to hear. I was saying, I just feel so called to perform that practice in my life, or to steep myself. That's the thing that's getting me through right now, is my personal relationship to love, and to leaning my individuality into something that feels like it can hold me, that's not of this world, or very much of this world. And so I'm wondering first, maybe to start off, where you are in your spiritual discipline in this moment, and just maybe even to add to that, me hearing you say, if you're not experiencing at least some level of heartbreak or grief, then maybe you're not paying attention. And so what does your practice of your own heart look like, and how do you define bhakti?
All right, that's juicy, very juicy. Yeah. Thank you. And I invite you to add into this. Excuse me, I'm having my computer's making noise. Yeah, I agree that is kind of, I think the core thing is, if there's one thing about this time at the moment, there's so many layers of grief that the world, our country, is going through. If you have at least one reason to be grieving, if not 10 or 1,000,000 or 400 years of grief in the case of racism in America. And so I recently actually lost my mother and my aunt, and it wasn't COVID related, but it was during this pandemic. And so there is a very tender and immediate quality of that for me at the moment. And what I find through all of this is I'm needing to basically, I wake up earlier than usual, and I don't get out of bed. I stay in bed because that's actually often the hardest time of the day, is like I wake up and it's what I wake up with, like whatever coping and strategic stuff I've done throughout the last day, the day before, as I sleep, all of those unconscious elements that may not have been given as much room to sort of present their needs, they're there and they're calling. And so I have found I've been doing some incredible sort of supportive, like therapeutic work in the internal family system type of psychology, and that's been incredible. And then also just like kind of trauma release, very simple trauma release stuff, where I'm really kind of acknowledging what's in the psychic space, acknowledging what's in the physical space, and then trying not to change it, except at the same time as I meet it, it changes. And then I do have kids and I have a life, and I have to get out of bed eventually. And then I usually will, so like it kind of rounded out usually with something to kind of open up my body in a very gentle way of opening up to the possibility of the day, the possibility of something that, so I'm not stuck in believing that things are going to stay the same, because they don't, even though sometimes it gets even harder when it changes, but at least making my quality of being a kind of vote for possibility. And just to kind of, talk about sort of the second part of that question about the definition of bhakti, I'm going to take one step back and be a little bit like scholarly here, is just to say that there's sort of two main paths of knowledge. You have bhakti yoga, and then you have jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge. And the way that Dr. Svoboda's Guru talked about it, and I think it's such a pith way to think about it, is that bhakti yoga is thy will be done, to use a quote from the Bible, thy will be done. So you're bowing to that. And then jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge, is my will be done. And it's not the little ego, it's that you've dissolved yourself. And so there is nothing besides that merging, which of course, from a psychological perspective, is a very big feat. Our ego is there for a good reason, and it's a friend and an ally. And so to dissolve that is no small feat. And it's also something where at some level, they both end up in the same place. They both lead you to the same place, but the bhakti is more about, you could say, relationship in the sense of having an outer and an inner. And it's like, you could say it's a little more inclusive of what we experience here in the embodied life, where there's duality. So there's this beautiful prayer from the Devi Mahatmya that I think is an excellent expression of bhakti. And the Devi Mahatmya is a tantric text in honor of the goddess, the Devi. And the heart of that text is a sequence of mantras, but the kind of central one is Sharana Gata Dinartha Paritrana Parayane Sarvasyartiyare Devi Narayani Namostute. And that shloka is essentially a prayer to Narayani, the goddess that has the name like Narayana, but it's Narayani. And what it is I've washed up on the shores of misery, and I don't even have the strength to lift myself. So all I can do now is pray for your support and for your grace to guide me on a path towards something beyond believing that this is all there is ever going to be, someplace. And so I feel like that there's so much blues in that shloka that feels really resonant for me as an American, as a white man in this current moment. It really resonates with deep Christian sentiment. I call it Christian bhakti. It's like this layer of acknowledging that I need relationship, I need support. So
yeah, I mean, as you're saying the prayer, tears come to me, and they came to me the first time you said it to me. It's just like this instant recognition of having been in that place so much. And I won't share it right now, but at some point I will, Scott. This coronavirus has been such a hard time for me too, and in a way unrelated to the virus itself, yet it's all related. And what I will say, I want to share this one thing. There's a story from Tara Brach where there's a Buddhist young man dying of AIDS in the hospital, and this Buddhist teacher was coming to him every night, and they had been studying together for several years, and he had really loved the Buddhist practices and meditations and mantras, but he had grown up like me, Southern Baptist, and had a lot of original imprinting around his sexuality and that religious tradition. And as when you die, you start to come up against these old parts of yourselves, like you were mentioning, from internal family systems. And he was literally in this misery that none of the practices were really getting to. And the Buddhist teacher decided to go home and get some rest. And on his way back, he remembered he had this little statue of Jesus back from when he grew up Catholic. And something told him, go get the little Jesus statue. And got it and brought it back. And as he's walking in the room, took down the tanka. Not that there was anything wrong with it, but just put the Jesus statue there. And right in that moment, this African-American cleaning lady walks in and sees the Jesus statue, and she says, "Mercy of Jesus Christ, when he is with us, all will be well." And the young man, sure enough, that traumatic material started to ease and release. And that story just touched me so much, because that has been what I've been really feeling, that place where, despite these 20 years and having the parasites from India to prove it, being immersed in these Eastern cultures, there's something about, and maybe this can lead us into more of the discussion I know we want to have, but something about coming home to our roots in this country as embodied creatures with lineages and histories, both the divinity and beauty and light of our ancestors and the great trauma and sins of our ancestors, and like how for me, and I don't want to say yoga failed me because I love yoga, but it wasn't what I turned to when I was washed up on the shore in the same way. Turned into very much 7 years ago something of a crisis with around that, and I now feel like there's a reconciliation and a emerging from that. But I'm curious about whatever you really want to talk about, what comes up for you.
Wow. Yeah. You know, it's funny because lately that's been something that's come to my mind, and I've sort of uttered it as like a one-word prayer, is like, when things feel too big, I'll just ask for mercy. And I've been in my own mind kind of requesting it from the goddess, you know, and just saying, you know, at the moment, I know that I need to bear this, but I need a little space. I need a little space to continue to find the strength to bear the grief that I'm having, and just the overall sense of, again, the way the coronavirus has initiated such a profound revelation on so many levels about how there's no going back to normal. And that's the right thing, but it also is sort of almost like humorously bizarre how much trouble humans have with change, even though it's the one great truth, you know, and we're sort of just not wired for it, especially these really emotionally painful truths, and the shameful truths, and the horrific truths that we're having to carry, you know, especially again as a white man who knows that the lineage that my ancestors come from contributed to an incredible amount of suffering and racism in this country. So yeah, that's
and how to hold that, and you know, trauma informed, I guess you could call it, practice became really the cornerstone of my own spiritual human journey. And one of the things that you learn early on is that trauma is there's several schools of thought around the dissolving of trauma, and what most agree upon is that it typically doesn't get dissolved through simply talking about the problems over and over, and even through emoting them, that there's this need for this relational attuned body-based experience, and what I see and I worry about now, and I sometimes feel like the goddess asks me to go through things that probably I'll be sharing at some point to bigger groups of people that might need it. And one of the things that I've learned is what a seductive vortex traumatic material is. It's unlike anything else. It is a black hole that pulls you in and convinces you of its realness, and it feels very real, but in the moment it's not. You know, like you and I are sitting in a comfortable room, most of us, most of the time, right? Even if we don't have the greatest circumstances, many of us are okay in the moment, and yet our traumatic signaling is telling us otherwise. And so my practice really has been doing almost the opposite of what I was taught in this more patriarchal tantric lineage of pratyahara, which is the withdrawal of the senses. What I've been learning how to do is like get at my altar and actually hold things and experience them sensually, and orient the awareness to the outer environment so that that animal of the body can go, okay, this kid is safe. And you know, so this is so that's been this beautiful, I would call it feminine now approach to, and so humbling, right? To take everything you've ever learned that when I was 25 or 35, I was so sure of. And now to say, I'm actually not sure of that. And that's a part of the deconstruction.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. And I'm really on board with that. And in just the way, again, that you can bring something from another culture like India into American culture or Western culture in general, but all of the cultural conditioning is already there. And so the person has at best, some awareness that there's all these filters and lenses that are going to actually transform what that means to that person. The stuff that gets changed in translation and lost in translation in these cultural, downloads. And, one image that came to mind as you were speaking is that that our sense organs are how we, it's how we perceive everything. And there's been a very profound, in the Western culture, there's been a very profound shift in the language around how we use our senses that actually creates the break. And in between your body and your mind, between the way that you can actually connect into the trauma that you carry as a living thing and have it continue to grow and change and be a gift, be something that actually really deeply seasons you as a human, rather than it being, like you said, like this kind of vortex that can suck you in a way that is maybe like it keeps you spinning rather than it actually processing. And in that sense, the I think what we've gotten into is sort of something, well, I'll put it this way: in the East, they have something that actually is interesting. It was named this by Christian anthropologists that were going over to these Eastern cultures, and they called it animism.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, wow, these people, the tree is alive, the tree carries wisdom, the rock actually has, its sovereign power, and everybody in these communities, they're like, and it's still like that in India. Every little village has at least one tree or a rock that is a place of power and a place where offerings are made to, not necessarily, the big deities, but the local, the invisible deities, which is, from a kind of perspective, you could say they believe in these unseen things, but it's kind of like, well, if you knew how many little creatures like squirrels and raccoons and possums and birds and lizards and worms that live around your environment that you never see. They're really, really smart, and they just clear out. And as soon as you go to sleep, they're out and they're having their time.
Partying.
Yeah, and so it's not as esoteric as it sounds, but it was like, again, through the lens of, you could say, this anthropological lens that was informed from a Christian worldview, there would have been such a difference that they just did their best to name it something and then fit it into something that was a little bit freaky. I think it seemed a little bit crazy, but really at some level, this structure was about recognizing that your relationship to the more than human world, which is a phrase that this great writer David Abram, coined, which is all the things that I just named, but your relationship to that world is what keeps your human culture in check. If you're working with it, and so by extension too, and the yoga texts say this, your whole body is an ecosystem, and you have all those little critters that metaphorically and analogously live within you, and you have all the forces of creation and destruction, and you have the indestructible spirit, and you have all these layers. And that if you believe that you can observe it without merging into it, you will inevitably treat it as something that doesn't have its own life. You're going to treat it as if whatever you named it is what it is, rather than that fluid kind of engagement. And that's really, I think, one of the biggest differences with the way we practice yoga, is that if we go into the body and we're listening for the poetic whisperings and chirpings and bubblings and all the little things that are sometimes quite fantastic and esoteric, and some things that are super mundane and even drab, but you're in a space of seeing the senses as something that actually glues you into the truth, rather than something that you observe the truth from. And that's why the languaging is so important. And it was kind of impossible, I think, to not have the languaging of yoga reinforce the Cartesian split between the mind and the body, and to reinforce that belief that we are somehow can be separate
So
from
that sensing system, you're saying, if I'm looking outside at my sycamore tree, that overlay, because of conditioning, already just that capacity to sense already has that overlay on it because of conditioning. Whereas as I, remove these veils, I'm able to actually experience, the qualities of the trees and have that inform my own inner ecosystem as well.
Yes, exactly. And that's where, I read a beautiful poem by Mary Oliver yesterday, and poets have kept this alive. The Western poets they keep reminding us incessantly about this truth that we're talking about, that this is, in some ways, it's seen as being poetic, but it's actually, so it's considered to be special. Whereas if it was considered normal, we
Right.
would be different.
You would just be talking that way.
Yes, exactly. And it's interesting too, because the roots for the term wisdom has sort of two etymological roots in Latin, and one of it has to do with guidance. It's like, the sage on the stage telling you what to do. Yeah, here's the truth, and you should follow what I say because I'm wise. And then the other side of it, though, is lyrical or lyricism. So the truth always has that lyrical quality, and that's what the poets bring out. Is they remind you of the song. And one of the lines in the poem I read by Mary Oliver was that the way that blades of grass pray. Like you just, again, and I've been doing that a lot lately because we've gone through the summer and the spring with COVID, and just to remind myself to look around and see how well the plants are with the humans not doing as much, and the sky has been clearer than ever in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there's been so much natural exuberance that it just strikes a counterbalance to my human aspect of my experience and informs me about this incredible space of life and that basic fortitude that's carried in it, and reminds me that that's in me too.
Yeah, I think there's also, I think about Jung and his almost warning to Westerners when studying these Eastern traditions, be careful, because we actually hold, just as we hold the trauma within the lineage, we hold gifts that for me have been largely unaccessed until lately. And like there's a whole, like, Christians have been holding sacred sexuality and sensuality and spirituality together for longer than we've held it apart. Like if you look at the traditions of magic and Hermeticism and Gnosticism, you find a lot of the totems and myths that our collective psyche actually has more innate access to. And you also find all of these references that directly mirror the tantric tradition. Yeah. And so there's also this like great hope inside of me that within my body and my bones, and at the end of the day, we're all one lineage, but that within me, there is something unaccessed that I had rejected, having given up Christianity and having given up especially the lineage that I grew up in, that now as I age, I'm beginning to see that hold a lot of sweetness for me. And there's a lot to say around that. I know we have several things we want to talk about.
When you bring that up, my twin brother, I have a twin, and he reminds me.
I thought you said my twin brother had a twin. I'm like, how is this possible?
Right, that would be triplets.
Yeah.
But he's mentioned several times that Prince is like, the musician is like the quintessential, like strong Christianity with strong sexuality integrated. Perfect. And so when you hear that music and you put it through the lens that he was such a deeply Christian person, that then it's like, oh,
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, okay, maybe this sort of brings us into this next realm that we wanted to speak of, which is you had mentioned in another talk I was listening to you give about the Corona Devi, like just that one shift in perspective, that we were able, for those of you that don't know, Devi means the goddess, to be able to actually witness Corona as a goddess has like really shifted my whole relationship to this. And so maybe speaking to that way of viewing this moment.
Yes. Absolutely. And there was, I guess, an Irish sculptor who sculpted the Corona Devi, sculpted the Corona as a goddess.
Wow. All right, we're
And
gonna have to
Dr.
find.
Swoboda was the one that sent that along to me, and I don't have the reference for it here, at my fingertips, but yeah, that there's so much power that has been infused into our lives with this, so much radical change that this is
Possibility.
force. Yeah, this is spiritual level force. It's the kind of force that's inexorable and asks you, it asks you to imagine things you could not have imagined before, and then suddenly you're living in the world that you couldn't have imagined before, and then the things that come out of that world, all the different, right up to today where we're in this moment, and that yeah, and so just that there's ways that we choose to change, and we do it by our own hand and with support from community and expert guides, and then there's ways that you are initiated by
Fire.
Yes, by fire, exactly. Yeah. And it actually makes me think of, I'm sorry, I'm filled with like quotes today, or just
Bring
things
it
that
on.
I thought of this one. Yeah, I found this beautiful quote from the Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams, and what she said, it was in reference to this election. So the quote it was in the New York Times. Our anxiety comes from the desire to have things be different. There's going to be the day after the election and the day after that. We need to be present to what is, regardless of the outcome you want. My ancestors, meaning Black folks, had to prepare themselves over and over for moving forward toward a freedom that was nowhere in sight. We prepare for life as it unfolds, not our ideal image of it. That is literally the only path forward. And I feel like that's what the Devi, our country and our Western narrative is so strongly invested in security and control and all these really patriarchal kind of, or you could say masculine qualities, and the masculine is great. But when it's heavy-handed, it doesn't work. And that's why we're facing all this stuff that we're facing at some level. There's a very direct, you could say, outcome to a certain worldview that doesn't accord with reality. And Dr. Svoboda's mentor liked to say, if you don't live with reality, reality will certainly come to live with you, usually at the least convenient moment. And so this whole thing of imagining, again, I think the reference to slaves, preparing them for a future that was nowhere in sight, that's when the real power of Bhakti comes, is you get to that level where you can't see it, and you know that you have a choice to either fall into despair and nihilism and collapse, or you do something else, and you have to invoke the possibility without any guarantees about how it's actually going to turn out, but that you again, or you yourself are going to be a vote for that possibility.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been waking up in the mornings, and I almost sent this to you before our call, Scott, but there's this beautiful gospel singer named Tasha Cobbs Leonard, and I'll put a link to her and later on in the notes, but I'm going to send you this song. And I have had it on repeat, like a mantra, for the past three, starting with election day. And of course, all beings are infinite intersections of millions of different experiences, but there seems to me that there's something about the Black female experience that's coming through and asking, like that Corona Devi, it's like, you think I'm the lowest rung of society? Actually, no. Like, here is my power. And I've just been really grateful for gospel singers right now of all orientations and races, but particularly Black women. They've been my greatest gurus right now. And what she sings about is just this mantra over and over about, my name, you know my name, you know my name. And of course she's referring to Christ, but this sense of belonging to something outside of the patriarchy, outside of the social conditioning. You know, I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and everybody thinks this is the Boulder of Virginia. And yes, it's amazing here, but do not get it twisted. Charlottesville is operating on the good old boys club, and I got first-hand witness of it over the coronavirus. And I'm not going to talk about it yet, but one day I will. And what I'll tell you is that Southern good old boy culture is still so alive, you know, and I have been wrestling with it, Scott. Like you don't know me that well, but people can tell you, I can fall in love with a telephone pole. Like I'm a merger. I'm an empathy junkie, you know, and that journey for me now has been to learn how to actually create those good boundaries. But within that, there's been this new experience in me of pure and utter rage at injustices. And I mean, out of hand, like waking up in the morning and, like you said, having had dreams all night that are just not like me, you know, and wrestling with anger and wrestling with revenge and wrestling with all of this fear, really. And there just came a point when I just said, you know what, I just started turning on the gospel music and hearing that you know my name over and over and over again. There was a way in which, I mean, I know you have had these experiences that without sitting down and doing a lot of work at it, this light started to flow through me and this power started to flow through me. And I began to just feel myself as myself. And in that space, like, I am open to looking at my white privilege. I am open to doing the hard work. I'm like, there's a way that it just humbles you and cracks you open, but at the same time, no one is going to mess with me. Do you know what I mean? It was like this really solid sense of like, something has my back that's bigger than that narrative.
Yes. Wow. That's so beautiful. I have a really dear friend who does a lot of work in this space. Her name is Monisha Chandanani, and she's Indian, she's Indian American, born here, and as a person of color, female, she has worked so much in dominantly white spaces around equity, diversity and inclusion for years and years, and at very high levels. And the way, she's one of my best friends, and she's really powerfully insightful. And one of the things she has said over and over is that heartbreak is what's going to heal us. That's what's going to heal white folks, is the heartbreak. Because like you said, the rage comes because something in you knows that you become like a volcano, and the volcano is going to burn down this old structure. Like it starts to generate the kind of force that can feel really, really out of control at some level. But it also is the kind of power when the thing that's had a cork in it just is no longer there. And then that the heat of it can actually melt things. And one of the things that she said, and this is really consistent with sort of Ayurveda and Chinese medicine, is that white supremacy culture and the mindset of it, that is really the dominant mindset, doesn't matter what your color or your gender or any of that, is like a mucus, and it's very sticky. And so the heat that comes from the rage and from the heartbreak and from the fear, the way that generates this incredible power, that's the only thing that's going to dry it up. That's the only thing that's going to clear it. And that's exactly what we do in herbal medicine is, mucus always has to be dried. You always have to use a spicy herb. And sometimes you have to use a spicy bitter herb, and the bitterness
I know bitter.
And so that's the thing about grief, is that grief has a bitter flavor, and it's really hard it's a hard thing to acquire a taste for. We are hardwired as humans to just sort of like hope it is over soon because it's so bitter.
Yeah.
But at the same time, bitter has this drying effect that can, just like a good cup of coffee for a drunk person, can get you a little more sober, so you get a little more clear-eyed about what you're actually doing.
Right. Yeah, and relating all of this to Ayurveda, and because of that heat and spiciness, and like meeting like, and how we need the spicy herb to kind of sometimes push the inflammation through, the ojas, like the love and like amount of
Yes.
support and lovers, in the sense of like friends and just mama energy to coat around all of the grief and rage that, and as a woman, this has been a new thought. I'm always thinking about this topic. Like, there's no way that I can know what it feels like to be a Black person in this country. I can read the books, I can listen to my friends, which I try to do, both people of color and white people. There's no way I can know in this moment as a white woman. But what I do know, I know what it feels like to be a woman. And that's been and maybe this will be useful to listeners, for me to actually know what it feels like to be mistreated in that way because of my sex and my gender, deeply harmed in the most horrific ways as a woman, as so many women have on this planet, Sagat,
Yes.
It's like 1 in every 3 women. And to know that so intimately myself, I had this, and it hurts and it sucks and you want it to be over. It's like, why am I eating a neem popsicle all the time? The bitterness. But what I'm realizing through Corona Devi's fire is like, this is how I can have a taste of what it feels like to be Black in America. And it was just like, and it's not the same, but like, my whole being was like, oh my God, I get it. I get the anger that doesn't go away. That's what trauma feels like.
Yes.
And yet, so how do we hold two things at once, as we do in Tantra, right? Like, this is what I want to put out there in the world through this podcast and Instagram, and is to say, guys, can we do all of this painful, dark work of trauma release and acknowledgement and feeling those feelings, while at the same time, as we do in trauma release, our body is also always sending us signals of safety and goodness and ease and mercy and love. Like, that is here too.
Yeah.
But because this is such a traumatic, intense vortex, to actually lean into the body's sense of love and ease and goodness, that is actually the Herculean effort. That's actually the weightlifting at this moment. It's so easy for me and you and all of us to come together and go, oh, and it's beautiful and we need it. Like, let's talk about our grief, and we need to, but now how can we hold that? But also, like, Scott, like, let me reflect back to you all of the beauty I see in you and all the deep layers of friendship. Like, let's talk about what's so right. And when you said Corona Devi, I'm like, yes, how is she our goddess and our healer, catapulting us all to the next level?
That's true. And what I'm hearing from a lot of my friends from the BIPOC community is that they are tired and they need the white people to do their own work.
Exactly.
They're not going to carry us, and that there's so much, just you said it so beautifully, of we have to hold both all at once. And that's enlightenment, actually.
Yeah, actually.
Like, you're holding both of the polarity is complete. And then you don't ever leave hell and you don't ever leave heaven. You actually are both. And then you're going to traverse on the daily basis between shades of one thing more than another, but you also learn to know the territory. And it brought up something I think also that's very useful for the listeners, in terms of, I assume this is a crowd that practices yoga and is enamored of those practices, and something that's been very intuitive for me in the practice, and it's been how I've been sort of, you could say, sequencing what I do with my yoga practice lately personally, and it's been healing, is that I am still doing the kind of work, meaning holding certain poses, down dog, vasisthasana, Mayurasana, poses that are really intense. They take a lot of, you have to be very firm. And the way I've been working it is, and taking time coming in and out of these postures to be like, can my limbs be strong so that I can continue to carry myself, literally and figuratively, without it infecting the core of my body with unnecessary tension. So it's this fine line of like, how do I hold that, you could say, yang polarity, and not abandon myself in the ways that I need to be ultimately tender, that where the tenderness is the life, and where the tenderness reveals the grief and continues to hold the rage and the fear and everything else. So I'm not leaving anything behind when I become strong. And then at the same time, doing again, like where, and it's mostly, I actually start the practice, because it's like from the moment that I wake up in the mornings, it's kind of like the practice begins. But I spend I kind of wait if possible until I've done that surrender work, where it's sort of, you could say, yin within yin. Like if I'm learning to be yang or yin within yang, like I'm protecting the core, openness, fluidity, release, while I'm strong with my limbs. That's sort of the yang within the yin. And then the yin within the yin is the way you do restorative practices. You do yoga nidra. You do practices that will, or trauma release practices that aren't derived from yoga tradition, but they're receptivity practices where you become really adept at meeting, being with, and then inviting in light and expansion, so that those things, again, the yang energies come in to merge with those deep yin energies, but from this entirely different expression. And that right now it feels like having those two polarities in the practices is really essential for keeping me healthy. And that's partly because I'm a parent and I'm a doctor and I have people that rely on me, but it also feels, it feels resonant with what you were saying, and I thought it would be maybe something useful for the audience. Is don't think, and this is where the languaging comes in. Don't think of your sun salutes as being some kind of exercise, or, oh, it's just yang and I can't do the trauma release work in my sun salutes because they're too dynamic and it's too exercising. No, do the trauma release while you're doing the sun salute.
Right.
Be with it in the deep restorative postures too, and then everything else in between, so that your practice you never abandon yourself in there, in the pursuit of one thing or another. And then especially if you're doing subtle work like yoga mudras and stuff, it becomes even more important. And so these things all set up that possibility for subtler work like pranayama or mudra or something.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of my shamanic teachers says, soft inner, firm outer. And she was actually relating it to an experience that I had with a student where she really, really laid into me in front of a big group of people, and how I, young and unprepared, kind of went a little bit hard outer, because inside I felt really, really mushy. And so what would it be like to actually, it's actually firm inner, soft outer, to like in that moment, and my hand even coming into that mudra of like, I know who I am, and I know I'm like, I know that I'm light. I've had the experience of who I am. It is light, and so now I can like let that outer experience not hit me so much like a poison, like it felt like a poison arrow. And then of course I wanted to bring up my defenses, which, in the animal body is healthy. But I think really learning, I see a lot of us, oh my God, like the banana sandwich circus that is our political world, where what's being mirrored to us is no inner stability, constant outer, you're like a pile of mush inside. And so you've got that firm outer, wounded masculine, because And this is something I'm sure you and I could speak of for hours, but this whole discussion that gets people upset around the feminine and the masculine is so misguided, because it's both the feminine and the masculine in those perverted senses that are the problem with everyone. And that we actually haven't had a lot of mirroring of what the feminine and masculine actually even look like.
Yes. Wow. I think that's so well put. And it's such again, this is where some of the Taoist images are really useful, because you have yin within yin, you have yang within yang, you have yin within yang, and you have yang within yin. And so what you're describing there, yang within yin, is that firmness when the body is soft. And that's going to have to come from a subtler level, because you've actually opened the body and made the body receptive. And so it becomes temporarily in that space, that softening makes a certain polarity. And then the counterbalance is going to be the way that the mind is able to hold in there, so that you're actually at some level, you know, the healthy body, even when it feels completely relaxed, the organs don't prolapse, nothing actually drops. You feel like it's all kind of going soft, but actually the integrity of it gets even more firm in that space. And then vice versa, which is, you know, kind of what I was referencing a little bit around the way that if you make the outer body really firm, the inner body has to counterbalance it, and the mind has to counterbalance it by being receptive and not letting the firmness infect the polarity or the spaces that need to be protected for their suppleness and for their vulnerability. And, you know, lately, like, I think a good example in, you know, like in Paschimottanasana, the heart area has its 5 elements. You know, the heart has 5 elements. Everything has 5 elements. Everything's fractal in that way, it's holographic. So any part of the body could be understood through this lens of 5 elements. But like the leg, the leg, when you're in that little seated forward bend, if you're really clear with how you work your toes, that will actually affect your brain. If you're really clear with how you work your ankle, it really affects your neck and your throat, and the little shifts in that can actually preserve the space that you need to have it feel like you can engage without having the hardness, you know, take over on the inside. And up the leg, the shin bone is relating to respiratory diaphragm and midsection. The knee is really related to the heart. The thigh bone itself actually relates to the kidney and the way that the whole circulation pattern through the back body is. And then the hip joint itself is actually what creates this great space where you feel like you can be in it, and you could be very, to quote, deep in the shape without feeling like you've got any confinement at all. You don't feel like you're kind of stuffing yourself into the shape, even though you might be really flat out. And again, the interesting thing for me, and this is what I want to point out, is like the leg work releases the heart. That's the sum total of it, is that the whole chest space gets released when the leg work is articulated skillfully. And that this is like it's such an interesting meditation to be like, I'm going to use my leg to create this energetic opening inside of myself for this posture. And again, it's been something that I give credit to my long-term teacher, Chandra Remete, for helping me to kind of be able to move in that direction of relating to the parts of the body really deeply speaking to each other, and so that you can have these strong contrasts, and actually they rely on each other, they need each other to kind of find their full expression. And so just throwing some more stuff out.
Well, it's taking me down this whole path that we kind of spoke on when you and I met privately of, you know, I spent 15 years doing this certain form, if you will. And what I'm realizing now is the magic, and I've taken a few yoga classes with you and was kind of astounded at what I'm working with a nervous system expert out of Portland. And one of the things that she's kind of like a seer, like a rishi. She can look at the physiology and go, okay, so this is what the animal's bone structure looks like in fight or flight in human beings. And like, here are the 5, 6, 7 stages of fight or flight. And this is what the bone structure does. Like, we're really predictable. So see the way that when you're walking, your pelvis is kind of going in towards the midline, when normally it moves along the horizontals. And like all forms of, feminine form of dance is all this sort of, and the bones of the face do this horizontals, the cranial bones, the pelvic bones, the rib cage does the horizontals. And okay, now, so I was so confused because I was like, does this mean I could never do yoga again? She's like, no, all things can be yoga when you're paying attention to, and her whole thing, her name's Alicia Farhado. All my listeners know I talk about her all the time. She's like, just hold 2 points of space and time. It's that simple.
Yes.
The brain needs to know how to map itself in space and time. That's how it orients to the body as space, but also the greater environment as space. And so it makes me think of that yogic concept of Bindu. And then from the original one comes the everything, that second point, that spaciousness. And then our job and what her research is showing is that when you anchor the awareness in 2 points in the body for any of them, right? It could be the heart and the shin bone. It could be the collarbone and the jawbone. But when you do that and you maintain a sense of non-judgmental presence, and you're not holding any intention, you're not forcing anything to happen, you're not even that concerned about alignment, because if you can anchor that for, now studies show the brain takes about 90 seconds to map the whole body, but 90 seconds is a long time, 60 to 90 seconds, the body starts to reorient its entire self. And what she's shown me is that brings us out of the fight or flight patterns and freeze patterns that are constantly being reinforced every time we walk around or lift our arm. And so that's really been, and so a lot of my practice, even with my meditation now, is just like, okay, here's my collarbone, and here's my acromion process, like, and just hanging out there, Scott, like, even if I'm just sitting around and, so I'm curious, like and as we do when we are on the path, like I've gone very top down, tell the body what to do. And now I'm very much, okay, I'll like go into the body, bottom up, let the body reveal to you what its wisdom. And, just like the symbol of the cross, like it's that place in the middle and so I want listeners, because listeners always write us and they're like, does this mean that yoga is bad or that, and it's not that at all. It's really like holding those two things, like, and so I'm curious how your asana evolution has, or your journey with that has kind of developed.
Wow. I love hearing about, again, some of the, you could say, modern explorations around, especially around trauma, because the deep truth of the body will reveal itself if you listen sincerely. And so in the context of sort of like yoga practice, I'd say the way that, and I'm really grateful for this, is the way that I was always encouraged to practice was that when you come in contact with the life force, when you meet your body's intelligence, it automatically makes you humble and gentle. It will automatically have that effect. Suddenly there's going to be a shift.
So that's how you know you're actually in the life force.
Then you know you're in, right? And
wait, so say that again.
Yeah, and again, this was something Chandra taught, but it was that when you come into communion with the life force, you automatically become humble and gentle.
I love
that. Yeah, and those are like such beautiful essential qualities. And so within that, and this is one of the places where I feel like, my own training and my own kind of process with it has been that the way yoga is articulated is there's a lot of like, here, put yourself in this box and then pull a Houdini and get back out of the box, like unscathed, And
right.
And that's a great skill set to have. Like, how can you put yourself in all these different shapes and find freedom?
Right.
That's incredible. And if you overdo that, then suddenly everything is formalized. Everything's got a certain amount of control. Everything's got a certain amount of rigidity.
And you're identified with the box.
That's right. Yes, you lose the box for the genie inside of it, kind of thing. And then on the flip side, some people will come to embodied practice, somatic practice from a perspective of more free form and formless kind of practice. And that in some ways is like kind of the high art, You
Yeah.
know, that's like, and so I appreciate the kind of formal structural piece, and also the kind of, again, the messaging that life force is formless. So we're putting you in this box to make the contrast for you really clear between this thing that's kind of fixed and this unfixed essence that's behind it and within it. But then vice versa is, how can you enter into unstructured movement, unstructured feeling and exploration without kind of, you could say, losing the subjective, or I guess what it would be is that you become too merged with one aspect, and then you start reifying and turning that.
That's exactly what I was going to say. You run the risk of merging, and you know, I get this. I think it was Dr. Claudia Welch, who I actually interned with for a while, and just love her to death. And she said, you know, this isn't all about just like putting on a flowery skirt and spinning around. And I kind of always had that as like the idea of that like imbalanced in a way feminine element where you're in that chaotic, you know, because I do a lot of free form dance at Shakti school, but there's so much discipline actually needed to be a wild person, you know, that otherwise you run the risk of merging. And that comes back to our discussion on trauma. As that material is being released, what becomes ever more necessary is that capacity that we actually have to lean back and be that quality of witness as material arises, lest we merge with it. And when your little child is coming up who's 5 years old, who didn't have love from mom or dad, like, it's so compelling. Like, the work is actually differentiation.
Yes.
You know? And so how to kind of find that in our physical movement practices is really, like you said, like the high art.
Yeah. It's interesting. A thought came to me while you were talking about that, where, you know, one thing about yoga is we go inside together. You know, the community is so important for us, you know, and then oftentimes the community is a communal experience of going inward. And that if somebody is witnessed moving by a group or by another, or they're witnessed praying, or, you know, like speaking the truth that's there, either, you know, again, through action or speech, there's such a profound update for their system, in the sense that they're suddenly right in the present moment, and whatever is happening is kind of verifiably real because it's being seen.
Witnessed.
Yeah. And and that's another way too. That's a subtle little thing about white supremacy culture, which is you handle your problems behind the scenes. Like, you're not transparent about the stuff. You project and you show up with your best self, which is good, you know, in theory, but it has a literal dark side, which is, you handle your stuff in private. And so the way that that's one way I think that yoga community can start to evolve in the direction of a more integrated form, is the way that communities of faith and communities in general, traditionally, they helped people by actually recognizing the nobility of showing up in your expression of your question, in your grief, and in your rage, and all those ways. But again, it's easier said than done, because it takes, you know, the elders, meaning initiated folks who have matured to the place of being able to know what they're unleashing. So the person who's being invited into that is actually in a safe space. And I don't want to make it sound too simple, but I also
No, it's not.
that the you know, when the Zen Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh has said for 30-40 years that the next Buddha will be the sangha. That's how he puts it. And that essence is, we're going to do this together, and you may not walk with everybody together, but you definitely won't go alone. You can't go alone. And this whole kind of hide your problem things is like, for the most tender, the most difficult thing, you're supposed to do it alone. You're supposed to do it inside. Like, you go to the yoga class and you deal with it all while you're like
Scott, and what you're saying is making me think, another gal friend of mine, Kimberly, was saying, we roll out our mats in these yoga studios that are very much products of like the 1980s aerobics culture. And you get on your mat and you don't look at anyone in the room and you start to do your practice. And imagine if you were, God forbid, to turn to go hi while you're in downward dog. It would just be unbelievable, right? And so
Right.
I've actually been kicked out of one studio in Ohio, and I hold that as a badge of honor. I got kicked out during my class, because I was like, get rid of these mats, like look at each other in the face. And like, now what you're saying is like, we're doing yoga, I don't even know what to call what I teach, but like we're doing practice out at an old 4-H club in the woods around a bonfire. And I'm just like putting on music and we're shaking, and then I'll stop and I'll be like, all right, let's explore Warrior One. And then at the end, imagine this, Scott. I mean, maybe one day we'll all do this together as elders.
Yeah, I'd love to do that.
Scott, I'm covered in chill bumps. So like, and by the way, people are coming to this class, dudes are coming to this class in their flannel shirts that like are farmers out here in Virginia. And at the end of class, we all sit around the bonfire and they can lay in Shavasana, but mostly we just sit there. We do some more stuff inside the body to prepare, and we meditate together. And then at the end, we do this kind of Quaker thing where I'm just like, look, we're going to be with the fire. If you have anything to share and say, let it come out. And babe, I mean, the stuff that's come out, especially of these men who have no outlet. And I'm all for men's groups, and I think men need men's groups, and I love men's groups, but we need women and men together, you guys. Like, I've had so much healing come through to be able to sit with my friends and my people and be like, guys, I know I just taught this class, but like, I'm holding a lot of anger right now. And if I can just let the group know about that. And sure enough, like the next week, 3 students like mention it or like call me up, or, and I don't even like that word student, but I think there's a value in like holding space as leadership. But one of the things that's been so amazing for me is to like, no, like I need this more than anybody. Like I need this as much as anyone. And I like this idea that maybe we can continue to flesh out. Like yoga studio as community and Buddha enlightenment as sangha. I feel like we could talk for like hours and hours. I want to be respectful of your time. And
this is so fun. No, and I just have to say it's such a beautiful image, because I have been in spaces that are men only spaces and then mixed spaces, meaning men and women, or I should say, everybody.
All spectrum.
Non-binary, the whole spectrum. And that I agree that, and again, it comes back to that there is a kind of, there's a way when given the right circumstances that people will pray organically. They may, and their prayers may start in one place where they're really saying, they're uttering and showing things that have been long sheltered or not seen, and that it's this incredible journey that will lead to just the deepest expression of wisdom and truth, from people who are not invited to kind of open that voice in public, to be given that. It's like an innate quality that we all carry. And so that's, I think, one of the blessings as teachers and yoga teachers, is we're invited to actually utter and invoke really beautiful things. We're invited into that position, just like a reverend would be invited into that position, or a counselor, or somebody who's holding space, a mentor. But that when we turn it around and we start to really decenter as the leader in terms of our voice, and we let the voice of the whole group become the voice, then the truth starts to ping pong around the whole group, like you said, where people are coming back and they love you and they're glad you're holding this space, but it was dude over in the flannel that actually said something in the way it came out, and the sincerity and the depth of feeling that left them feeling it for a week, and they're just glad to be back because they know that the voice of something is coming through. And so that's so beautiful. And I do feel like that's part of the evolutionary transformation that's taking place in the yoga world. And that, again, there was a lot of like, oh, you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that. That was based on some respect of tradition, you could say, but also something that now, thanks to Corona Devi, we need to really question, not because it was wrong, but because it isn't what we need anymore. It isn't what is actually current for us.
Mhm.
So yeah, so thank you.
Scott, this has been so amazing. I can talk to you forever. I wonder, we're sitting here and I'm going to try to get this out tomorrow. And so maybe we'll know if we have a president tomorrow. You know, we're in this moment where I think the memes are really tight right now. Like the memes are blowing up, but I'm wondering if you have any just last words of wisdom for folks who are feeling the collective anxiety of this time.
Yeah. Again, that quote from the Reverend Williams, for me, is so essential to recognize that this is not new. And like you said so beautifully, welcome to the club where you're frightened and you don't know what's coming next. And all you can do is center in the prayer and be like, your vote is a prayer and you are a prayer. And one way is to think about it is, you have the life force within you, but your body has sort of got a lot of solidity, and all the things that your mind is invested in, those solidities, you have all the space that's right around you. You could call it like your auric field, or like there's a part of you that's becoming. Part of you that's in the process of where something non-material is actually taking up residence in the material space that you are. And so that in that space, that's where the bhakti lives. Like, are you going to be waiting for the outside to give you permission to change the inside? Or are you going to be a prayer where you're changing the inside as a vote and a polarity and a kind of, a literal transformation of the outer space, even when you can't see the light, and that's the thing that's so deep in that quote to me, is that for how many generations did people, they couldn't even see a glimmer, and then they'd get a little, and then they get crushed, and then what comes out of that, the kind of art like gospel music, where there's a movie. Aretha Franklin did this concert in 1973, and then they showed the documentary, came out last year.
I saw it.
You saw it, yeah. So I would say everybody watch that.
Go watch that.
Because again, that backup singing group and the leader of that backup group, the whole scene is so powerful. But yeah, it's just, again, where welcome to the club, where you don't know at all, but you're filled with trepidation. And who are you going to be right now? Because you do have power, and that power is actually a prayer. Yeah. So
oh, Scott. Well, I want to just thank you from the bottom of my heart. I feel like this has been as my mama, would say, who's one of my teachers, like, this has been a divine appointment. It feels like this has been a divine appointment for me every time I talk to you, but like personally, and I just want you to know that I'm here for you as a sister, and I'll definitely be holding you and your family in my thoughts and my heart and my prayers. And I just think that there's so much more. We're gonna hope and pray we can get you back in some way into the Shakti school. I think there'd be a lot of great things we can do together. But is there anything you want to let people know about that you are offering that we could support you in?
I recently started a teachable school, and I have done some work on Ayurveda and the microbiome with Dr. Svoboda, my mentor, it's been such a joy to teach with him. And there's such profound insight when you look at health through the lens of the microbiome and then tie it into Ayurvedic understanding. So at the moment, I'm actually working on a curriculum. So for the next couple of months, there won't be anything like above board, because I'm really plugged into that until January, and then there'll be a winter course that starts. But if you go to the Teachable page, it's like drblossom.teachable or whatever.
Yeah, we'll put the links for you guys.
Yeah, so I have a Teachable page that's Dr. Blossom, and it's spelled out DOCTOR Blossom, and that's got the kind of upcoming, but it's also where I'm starting to deposit some things that are deep studies and deep ruminations on some incredible stuff, in my humble opinion, incredible stuff. Yeah, but I would love to come back, and I would love to dream up some collaborations in the Shakti school, because this has been, I think.
This could be a powerful, I'm holding it in my heart, and and I think just this sense that Corona, I want to end on this. Bless our hearts. The Corona goddess is alive and well, and that she, just like thinking of her in that Kali-esque we look at her with her bloody tongue, my friends, but she's the one who loves us the most, that she's unwilling to let us stay stuck.
That's right. Jai Ma Corona Devi.
Devi Namaha. Thank you so much, Scott. It's
Thank
been
you. Thank
Have
you
a
to
great
everyone
day.
too. It's been such a pleasure. Right on.
All right. See you later.
ফোটে ফুল আপন সুখে ফোটে ফুল